The time is 3:13 a.m. The place is a stretch of asphalt so lonely it has forgotten its own name, a vein of blacktop pulsing faintly in the heart of the Nevada desert. This is U.S. Route 395, a corridor of silence where the sky is so vast and so dark that the stars seem to bleed into the earth. For Frank Coleman, a man whose life was measured in rotations of a wheel and the hiss of air brakes, this was just another Tuesday. Another 1,000 miles to conquer before the sun burned the cobalt from the sky. His 18-wheeler, a beast of chrome and steel named the Vagrant, was his kingdom, its cabin, a sanctuary of worn leather, stale coffee, and the familiar drone of a diesel engine that had been his only companion for the better part of 2 decades. But on this night, the familiar symphony of man and machine would be silenced by a conductor it could not comprehend. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper of light, a pinprick on the horizon, too low for a star, too steady for an aircraft. Frank, his eyes trained by years of scanning for deer and highway hypnosis, noted it with a professional detachment, a tower perhaps, a distant ranch. But the light grew. It did not simply get brighter, it expanded, blossoming from a point of distant curiosity into an orb of impossible luminescence that painted the serrated peaks of the distant mountains in shades of ethereal blue and green. Then the silence came. Not a gradual quiet, but a sudden surgical removal of sound. The engine of the Vagrant didn't sputter or cough, it simply ceased to exist. The radio, which had been murmuring a forgotten country song, fell into a void of static-free nothingness. The hum of the tires on the pavement vanished. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, that Frank could hear the frantic drum of his own heart against his ribs. His truck, now a 10-ton glider, coasted to a stop in the exact center of the desolate highway. The dashboard was dead. The headlights were extinguished. All that remained was the alien glow ahead, which now resolved itself into a definite shape. It was a craft, and it was descending. It wasn't falling or landing, it was arriving, moving with a grace that defied the very concept of weight and thrust. It was a silent wound in the night, a tear in the fabric of the ordinary. What forces were at play on this forgotten stretch of road? What intelligence guided this silent, glowing behemoth? And for Frank Coleman, a simple man of mile markers and logbooks, the most terrifying question of all was yet to form on his lips. Why had it stopped for him? The universe, it seemed, had an appointment in the middle of nowhere, and he was the only one invited. The night air, once cool and crisp, grew thick, electric, heavy with an unspoken promise of revelation or ruin. The world outside his windshield was no longer his own. It belonged to the light. To understand the gravity of what happened at 3:13 a.m., one must first understand the man and the road. Frank Coleman was not a fantasist. He was a man forged from pragmatism and diesel fumes, born and raised in the hard-scrabble plains of Wyoming, where stories were tall, but belief was earned through tangible proof. At 57, his face was a roadmap of the highways he'd traveled, etched with the lines of countless sunrises and the weary squint of a man perpetually peering into the darkness ahead. He was a veteran of the road, a long-haul trucker who had seen it all. Freak weather, disastrous pileups, the strange mirages that heat and exhaustion can conjure on an endless ribbon of asphalt. He'd dismissed tales from other drivers at truck stops, stories of ghost lights and shadow figures, as the products of too many hours and too much caffeine. For Frank, reality was what you could touch, what you could fix with a wrench, what you could log in a book. His world was governed by the laws of physics, the regulations of the Department of Transportation, and the simple, brutal economics of supply and demand. He was, by every conceivable measure, the perfect witness, unimpeachable, grounded, and utterly unprepared for the impossible. The stage for his encounter was equally significant. U.S. Route 395 is more than just a road. It is a ley line of American strangeness, cutting a path through landscapes that seem to hum with a forgotten energy. Particularly this stretch, running along the eastern spine of the Sierra Nevada, is a place of profound isolation. It's a land of extremes, where ancient, bristle-cone pines cling to life at impossible altitudes, and the valley floors are littered with the bones of prehistoric lakes. To the east lies a vast, restricted territory, a checkerboard of military installations and secret testing grounds that the public knows only through rumor and speculation. This is the backyard of places like the Nevada test site and the infamous Area 51. The sky here is not empty. It is a theater for advanced, often unacknowledged military craft. Locals and travelers have long reported phenomena that defy easy explanation. Lights that execute 90-degree turns at hypersonic speeds, silent triangular craft that blot out the stars, and strange atmospheric plasma events that correspond with no known natural phenomena. The investigator, Dr. Eris Thorne, a physicist who had traded a tenured university position for the twilight world of ufology, had a name for this region. She called it the corridor. Thorne's research suggested that certain geographic locations, due to unique geomagnetic properties or other, less understood factors, acted as windows or hotspots for anomalous activity. The corridor, with its proximity to sensitive military airspace and its deep geological oddities, was one of the most active windows on the planet. Was it simply a case of mistaken identity, of secret military technology being misinterpreted by civilians? Or was the military presence here not the cause of the phenomena, but a response to it? Were they testing their own technology, or were they attempting to intercept or understand technology that was not their own? For centuries, this land had been sacred to the Paiute and Shoshone tribes, who spoke of star people and sky gods in their foundational myths. Their legends described beings who descended in fiery canoes to teach and, sometimes, to warn. These were not quaint folktales to be dismissed. They were an ancestral memory, a cultural record of repeated contact stretching back into the mists of time. Frank Coleman, a man of the modern world, knew nothing of these ancient stories. He only knew the road. He knew its dips and curves, its treacherous winter passes, and its soul-crushing summer heat. He saw it as a challenge to be overcome, a means to an end. He had never considered that the road itself, the very ground beneath his wheels, might have a memory and a character all its own, that he was merely the latest in a long line of travelers to witness its secrets manifest under a canopy of indifferent stars. The desolation was not empty. It was waiting. The silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence of something else. And on this particular night, the waiting was over. The hours leading up to the event were, in retrospect, colored by a subtle but pervasive wrongness. Frank had pulled out of a depot in Carson City just after sunset, his trailer laden with machine parts bound for Southern California. The drive was routine, one he'd made 100 times before. Yet, something felt different. The air itself seemed to carry a static charge, a low-level hum that was felt more than heard, a pressure against the eardrums that he initially dismissed as a change in altitude or the onset of a headache. He fiddled with the radio, a habit born of long hours of solitude. He could usually pull in a clear signal from a station in Reno or even a powerful AM broadcast from Salt Lake City. Tonight, however, there was only static, not the usual crackle and pop of a weak signal, but a strange rhythmic hiss, a sibilant pulse that seemed to have a deliberate, almost organic cadence. It was like listening to the universe breathe. He turned it off, preferring the familiar growl of his engine. As he pushed deeper into the desert, leaving the last vestiges of civilization behind, a profound sense of isolation descended upon him. This was not the comfortable solitude he was used to, but a more primal feeling of being utterly and completely alone, a single point of warm-blooded life in a vast, indifferent geology of rock and sand. And then came the feeling of being watched. It was an irrational, instinctual prickling on the back of his neck, the kind of ancient survival mechanism that alerts prey to a predator hiding in the shadows. He scanned his mirrors. Nothing. The road behind him was a black, empty ribbon. He looked to the sky. Only stars. Yet, the feeling persisted, growing in intensity with each passing mile. It was as if the entire, empty landscape had become a single observing eye. Dr. Eris Thorne would later document this phenomenon as a common precursor to close encounter events. She called it the sentinel effect. Witnesses frequently reported a period of heightened anxiety and paranoia, a feeling of being observed or targeted, hours or even minutes before the primary sighting. Thorne's controversial theory was that this was not merely psychological anticipation. She hypothesized that the intelligence behind the phenomena might project a field or signal that sensitive individuals could subconsciously perceive, a sort of psychic announcement of their impending arrival. It was, in her words, the psychic bow wave of an approaching reality. Frank, of course, had no such framework. He was just a trucker feeling spooked. He shook his head, took a long swallow of lukewarm coffee from his thermos, and cranked up the heater, blaming the strange feelings on fatigue. He was a professional. He had a schedule to keep. But the anomalies continued to stack up. Around 2:45 a.m., he noticed that the wildlife seemed to have vanished. Usually, on a night drive like this, his headlights would catch the glint of eyes from coyotes, jackrabbits, or the occasional desert fox. The night was typically alive with nocturnal creatures, but tonight there was nothing. An unnatural stillness had fallen over the desert. The world outside his cabin seemed frozen, a diorama waiting for an unseen hand to set it in motion. Then, a more tangible event occurred. A series of faint flickering lights appeared in his peripheral vision high above the mountain ridges to his west. They were like strobes, but silent and seemingly random in their pattern. He assumed they were military flares, or perhaps aircraft on maneuvers from the nearby Naval Air Station Fallon, but their movement was erratic. They would appear, pulse 3 or 4 times in a brilliant flash of white, and then vanish, only to reappear miles away in an instant. There was no discernible travel time between the points of light. They were simply there, and then they were not, and then they were somewhere else entirely. It was this detail that, even before the main event, lodged a splinter of genuine unease in his mind. He had seen every kind of military aircraft imaginable in this part of the country, from stealth bombers to experimental drones. They all moved, they all obeyed, in some fashion, the laws of momentum and inertia. These lights did not. They behaved like glitches in reality, like pixels on a screen winking in and out of existence. He was witnessing a prelude, a series of subtle tears in the veil of the mundane, each one preparing him for the final, catastrophic rupture that was now only minutes away, waiting for him just around the next bend in the road. The transition from prelude to performance was terrifyingly swift. As the vagrant crested a small rise, the world ahead was consumed by the blossoming light. After the truck coasted to its silent, powerless halt, Frank was no longer a driver. He was a spectator in a theater of the impossible, his front row seat the worn leather of his driver's chair. The object had now fully descended, hovering no more than 50 feet above the asphalt, perhaps 200 yards in front of his truck. It was immense. He tried to gauge its size against the familiar scale of his rig, and the calculation sent a tremor of fear through him. It had to be at least 200 feet across, a colossal, silent arbiter blocking his path. Its shape was deceptively simple, a flattened disc, a perfect lenticular form, like 2 massive dinner plates placed rim to rim. But its surface, its very substance, was unlike anything he could comprehend. It was not metallic in the way he understood metal. It seemed to be made of solidified light, a material that both emitted and absorbed the glow that surrounded it. The color shifted in slow, hypnotic waves, moving from a soft oceanic blue to a vibrant emerald green, then to a deep royal violet. There were no seams, no rivets, no visible means of propulsion, no windows, no hatches, no indication that it was a machine built by any recognizable hand. It was a singular, seamless whole, a piece of geometry that should not exist. A low hum began to permeate the cabin, vibrating not in his ears but deep within his chest cavity, a resonant frequency that seemed to shake the very marrow of his bones. It was the sound of immense power held in perfect check. The air outside, visible in the object's unholy light, began to shimmer, to distort, as if a powerful heat source was warping the space around it. Yet, Frank felt no heat. In fact, a profound and unnatural chill was seeping into the cabin, the temperature dropping so rapidly that his breath began to fog in front of his face. The very laws of thermodynamics seemed to be suspended in its presence. Frank remained frozen, his hand still gripping the useless steering wheel. His mind, a machine built for processing logical inputs, road signs, gauges, traffic patterns, was failing. It cycled through a frantic Rolodex of explanations, a new type of military blimp, a holographic projection, an elaborate prank. Each was dismissed as more absurd than the last. No blimp could be so silent, so massive, so luminous. No projector could create such a tangible presence, a force that could kill a 10-ton truck dead in its tracks and alter the very atmosphere around it. Terror was a cold knot in his stomach, but it was mingled with something else, a profound, overwhelming sense of awe. He was looking at the impossible made manifest. He was a man of the earth, of grease and steel, and he was staring at something that was unequivocally not of his world. The object began to move, not forward or back, but with a slight, almost imperceptible wobble, a slow, pendulous drift, as if it were an anchor in a current he could not see. As it moved, the light it cast swept across the desert floor, and the effect was bizarre. The sagebrush and rocks illuminated by the craft's glow seemed to become hyper-real, their colors and textures enhanced to an impossible degree of clarity. It was as if he were seeing the world for the first time in its true form, stripped of the dulling filter of ordinary perception. He noticed a detail that would haunt him for years. Directly beneath the craft, the asphalt of the highway was beginning to change. It was not melting from heat, but appeared to be shimmering, its surface molecules vibrating and realigning into strange crystalline patterns. The solid road was becoming fluid, geometric, a canvas for an alien physics. What kind of energy could do that? What kind of technology could rewrite the basic structure of matter with such casual, silent grace? This was not just a vehicle. It was a force of nature, an entity that carried its own physical laws with it, imposing them on the small patch of Nevada desert it now occupied. And Frank Coleman was trapped within its sphere of influence, a helpless observer to a violation of reality itself. The encounter then shifted from a passive observation to an active, terrifying interaction. The object ceased its gentle drift and became perfectly still, its humming intensifying to a pitch that made Frank's teeth ache. A single, focused beam of light, impossibly thin and brilliantly white, lanced down from the center of its underside. It did not strike the ground. It struck the hood of his truck. The beam was not hot. There was no smoke, no melting metal. It was a cold, analytical light, more like a surgical instrument than a weapon. It moved with intelligent precision, scanning the engine block through the solid steel of the hood as if it were transparent glass. Frank could feel a sympathetic vibration through the truck's frame, a deep thrumming that resonated with the humming in his own body. He was physically connected to this impossible examination. What was it looking for? Was it analyzing the primitive, controlled explosions of his internal combustion engine with the curiosity a biologist might reserve for a microbe? Was it taking a sample, or was it communicating? After what felt like an eternity, the beam retracted, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. The humming subsided back to its original, bone-deep thrum. The silence that followed was even more profound than before, a pregnant pause in a cosmic symphony. And then, it happened. The part of the encounter that Frank would struggle to articulate for the rest of his life. The part that no official report or skeptical debunker could ever explain away. The communication was not auditory. It was not visual in the conventional sense. It was a direct, instantaneous, and overwhelming flood of information poured directly into his consciousness. It was a torrent of images, emotions, and pure data that bypassed his senses entirely. He saw star charts of unknown constellations, the birth and death of galaxies, compressed into a single, breathtaking second. He saw alien biologies, creatures of immense beauty and terrifying strangeness, moving through landscapes of impossible colors and geometries. He saw vast crystalline cities humming with the same energy as the craft before him. He felt emotions for which he had no name, a sense of cosmic loneliness that spanned eons, a feeling of profound ancient sorrow, and a sense of purpose so vast and complex that his human mind could only grasp the smallest, most fragmented pieces. The message, if it could be called that, was not in a human language. It was a raw data stream of pure meaning. He understood in a way he could never explain that this craft was a probe, a scout, but also something more. It was a librarian, a cartographer, an archivist of life itself. He sensed that its purpose was observation, cataloging, and a deep, abiding, and utterly dispassionate curiosity. He felt the sheer scale of time that this intelligence represented, a lifespan that made human history seem like the brief flicker of a firefly in an endless night. In the midst of this overwhelming cascade of information, one specific sequence of images burned itself into his memory. He saw the Earth not as a blue marble from space, but as a complex biological and geological system, a living network of energy. He saw lines of this energy crisscrossing the planet, converging on specific locations like the very desert he was in. He saw historical events from a detached overhead perspective, migrations, battles, the rise and fall of civilizations, but they were all depicted as small, frantic movements on the surface of this much larger living system, like the scurrying of ants on a log. The overwhelming impression was one of scale. His life, his truck, his entire species, it was all so small, so temporary, so beautifully, tragically insignificant. The experience could have lasted a minute or 1,000 years. Time had ceased to have meaning. Frank felt his own consciousness, his own identity, begin to dissolve into the tidal wave of alien thought. He was Frank Coleman, the trucker from Wyoming, but he was also a dying star in a distant nebula and a crystalline life form on a methane sea. The sheer pressure of the information was threatening to shatter his sanity. Just as he felt he was about to break, to be completely subsumed, it stopped. The connection was severed. The torrent ceased. He was himself again, gasping for breath in the chilled cabin of his truck, the scent of ozone thick in the air. The object outside began to glow with a blinding intensity, the colors cycling faster and faster until they merged into a single point of pure white brilliance. And then, with a silent, instantaneous flash, it was gone. Not flown away. Gone. The stars it had obscured were back in their rightful place. The night was empty again. The only evidence that anything had happened was the profound, echoing silence and the image of a living planet seared into the mind of a terrified truck driver. The immediate aftermath was a sensory whiplash. The oppressive absolute silence was shattered as the world rushed back in. The engine of the vagrant roared back to life with a violent shudder. The dashboard lights flickered and then blazed, and the radio crackled on at full volume, blasting a commercial for a 24-hour diner in Tonopah. The mundane sounds were an assault, a vulgar intrusion into the sacred, terrifying stillness that had preceded them. For a long moment, Frank just sat there, his hands trembling, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was drenched in a cold sweat, his heart hammering a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting metallic, charged, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. Disorientation washed over him in nauseating waves. The images, the feelings, the sheer volume of alien knowledge he had been subjected to swirled in his mind like a psychic vortex. He felt physically ill, as if he had been exposed to some form of radiation. He checked the clock on his dashboard. 3:19 a.m. The entire event, from the moment his truck lost power to the instant the craft vanished, had lasted only 6 minutes. 6 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. It felt like his entire perception of the universe had been dismantled and reassembled into a new, terrifying, and incomprehensibly larger shape in the span of a commercial break on the radio. His first instinct was to flee, to put his foot on the accelerator and drive as fast as the truck would go, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that spot on the road. But he was frozen by a mixture of shock and a strange, new curiosity. He forced his trembling hand to shut off the blaring radio and kill the engine. He needed to think. He needed to process. He opened the cabin door, and the cold desert air hit him like a physical blow. The unnatural chill that had accompanied the craft was gone, replaced by the normal, crisp night air. But the smell of ozone lingered, sharp and sterile. He climbed down from the cab, his legs unsteady beneath him. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight, he walked towards the spot on the highway where the object had hovered. The beam cut a nervous path through the darkness. As he approached the area, his flashlight illuminated the asphalt. It was just as he had seen from the cab. The surface of the road was marked by a large, circular patch, roughly 50 feet in diameter. The asphalt was not burned or melted. Instead, it had a strange, glassy sheen and was covered in a network of fine, geometric, almost crystalline fracture lines, like a spiderweb made of glass. In the center of the circle, he found 3 distinct indentations, arranged in a perfect equilateral triangle. They were not deep, but they were clearly defined, as if a colossal weight had been briefly and delicately placed there. What had he seen? What had happened to him? The questions hammered at him, demanding answers his mind could not provide. He was a man who believed in a world of solid, dependable things. This was not solid. This was not dependable. This was a violation. He retreated to the safety of his cab and did the only thing he could think to do. He picked up his CB radio, his hand shaking so badly he could barely key the microphone. He called dispatch. His voice was a strained, hoarse whisper. He tried to explain what he had seen: the light, the dead engine, the craft on the road. The dispatcher on the other end, a weary voice accustomed to reports of accidents and breakdowns, was silent for a long moment. Then, a skeptical reply. Was he drinking? Was he on medication? Frank's frustration and fear boiled over. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't crazy. He was a man who had just seen something that shouldn't exist, and he needed someone to believe him. Reluctantly, the dispatcher agreed to notify the Nevada Highway Patrol of a potential road obstruction and a distressed driver. An hour later, as the first hint of dawn began to soften the eastern horizon, a pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. A state trooper cruiser pulled up behind his rig. 2 officers, their faces etched with a mixture of professional concern and deep-seated skepticism, approached his window. Frank tried to tell his story again, pointing to the strange markings on the road. They listened patiently, their expressions unreadable in the flashing red and blue lights of their vehicle. They took his statement, conducted a sobriety test which he passed easily, and examined the spot on the road with their own flashlights, murmuring to each other in low tones. They filed a report: an unusual atmospheric event, a possible electrical discharge affecting a vehicle, nothing more. But Frank saw something in the eyes of the older trooper, a flicker of something that wasn't skepticism. It was a look of guarded recognition, as if he had heard a story like this before. As the sun finally crested the mountains, bathing the desert in the clean, honest light of day, the troopers left. Frank was alone again, left to finish his drive with a shattered worldview and a story that nobody would ever truly believe. The machine parts in his trailer suddenly seemed like relics from another, simpler age. The report filed by the Nevada Highway Patrol, despite its mundane conclusions, contained enough unusual keywords to trigger an alert in a little-known civilian research network. This is how the case of Frank Coleman found its way to the desk of Dr. Eris Thorne. Thorne was a pariah in the academic community, a brilliant physicist who had committed career suicide by turning her formidable intellect towards the study of unidentified aerial phenomena. She operated out of a cluttered office in Santa Fe, funded by a handful of anonymous patrons who believed, as she did, that the phenomenon was real, worthy of serious scientific inquiry, and potentially the most important subject in human history. She approached cases not with the wide-eyed belief of a true believer, but with the rigorous methodology of a forensic scientist. She sought patterns, physical evidence, and credible, verifiable testimony. Frank Coleman, the pragmatic trucker with a 20-year unblemished record, was exactly the kind of witness she prioritized. 2 days after the incident, she was sitting across from Frank in a small roadside diner 100 miles from the encounter site. Frank was a changed man. The easy confidence of a career driver was gone, replaced by a haunted, anxious energy. He spoke in low, hesitant tones, constantly looking over his shoulder. He recounted the events of that night, his voice cracking with emotion as he described the silent craft, the dead engine, and the terrifying, incomprehensible mental contact. Thorne listened without interruption, her recording device capturing every word. She did not judge. She did not question his sanity. She asked for specifics: the exact time, the weather conditions, the precise sequence of events, the colors of the light, the pitch of the hum. She was not interested in his interpretation of the event. She was interested in the raw data. After the interview, she traveled to the site on Route 395. The strange crystalline pattern on the asphalt was still faintly visible, a ghostly etching on the blacktop that the highway maintenance crews had not yet paved over. The triangular landing gear impressions were also there, subtle but definite. She got to work. Using a portable Gauss meter, she took readings from the area. The background electromagnetic field was normal across the desert, but within the 50-foot circle, the readings spiked dramatically. There was a residual magnetic signature, a footprint of powerful energy that had saturated the ground itself. This was not the result of a lightning strike, which leaves a chaotic branching signature. This was a contained, focused, and geometrically precise field. Next, she took surface samples. She carefully collected scrapings from the asphalt inside the circle and control samples from 100 yards away. She also used a specialized magnetic tool to sweep the area for metallic residues. Her efforts yielded a handful of microscopic metallic flakes, barely visible to the naked eye, embedded in the asphalt within the triangular indentations. Back in her lab, the analysis of this physical evidence began to paint a startling picture. Under an electron microscope, the asphalt scrapings from the circle showed molecular deformation. The hydrocarbon chains were altered, compressed in a way that could only be achieved by exposing them to extreme pressure and a powerful, focused microwave field simultaneously. This was the source of the glassy, crystalline appearance Frank had described. It was a physical change at the molecular level. The metallic fragments were even more revelatory. Spectrometric analysis revealed they were composed of an alloy of magnesium and zinc, but with trace elements of bismuth layered in a precise crystalline lattice structure that Thorne had never seen before. Furthermore, when she examined the isotopic ratios of the magnesium, they were anomalous. They did not match the isotopic ratios of magnesium found anywhere on Earth. The implications were staggering. This was not just a strange material, it was a manufactured artifact with a provably non-terrestrial origin. She had in her hands physical proof. She cross-referenced the time of Frank's encounter with data from civilian satellite trackers and geological survey sensors. She found a corresponding anomaly. A massive, short-duration gravitational distortion was registered by a sensitive seismograph in the region, an event that was officially logged as unexplained seismic noise. It was not an earthquake. It was as if a massive object with its own gravitational field had briefly appeared and then vanished. The evidence was converging. A credible witness, physical trace evidence with anomalous molecular and isotopic properties, a corresponding magnetic signature, and corroborating sensor data from an independent source. For Dr. Thorne, this was no longer just another sighting. This was the case she had been searching for her entire career. It was a Rosetta Stone, a chance to prove to the world that we are not alone and that the visitors, whoever they were leaving behind more than just stories. They were leaving behind evidence that could be measured, analyzed, and understood. But as she prepared to publish her findings, a new, more familiar force began to move in the shadows. The authority had taken notice. The official story began to materialize about a week after the incident, trickling out through carefully managed channels. The first mention came from the Public Affairs Office at a nearby Air Force base. In response to a local journalist's query about strange lights reported on the night in question, they issued a terse statement. The United States Air Force had been conducting routine nighttime training exercises in the designated military operating area. These exercises involved the use of high-intensity illumination flares dropped from high altitudes to simulate battlefield conditions. The statement suggested that what the truck driver had likely seen was one of these flares, perhaps drifting in an unusual manner due to unpredictable high-altitude winds, creating a distorted and confusing visual for a ground-based observer. The electrical failure in the truck was attributed to a coincidental malfunction, a common occurrence in older, high-mileage vehicles. It was a neat, tidy explanation. It was plausible. And it was a complete fabrication. Dr. Thorne knew immediately it was disinformation. Military flares are magnesium-based pyrotechnics. They are incredibly bright, but they burn out quickly, they produce smoke, and they fall. They do not hover silently. They do not have a defined geometric shape, and they most certainly do not possess the ability to shut down the electrical systems of a 10-ton truck or leave behind residual magnetic fields and non-terrestrial isotopic materials. The official explanation was a carefully constructed fiction designed to quell curiosity and end the story. But it was only the beginning. 2 weeks after the event, 2 men in dark conservative suits paid a visit to Frank Coleman at his home in Wyoming. They did not identify themselves as being from any specific agency, carrying only simple government credentials that stated they were there on a matter of national security. They were polite, professional, and deeply intimidating. They questioned Frank for hours, going over his story again and again, their questions becoming more pointed, more accusatory. They suggested he might have been hallucinating. They brought up his driving schedule, implying that fatigue could have played a role. They hinted that spreading such stories could have serious consequences, that it could be seen as a threat to public order, that it could impact his commercial driver's license. The subtext was clear. Be quiet. Forget what you saw. The story you are telling is dangerous. Frank, a man who had never been afraid of anything on the road, was terrified. This was a different kind of threat, a quiet, bureaucratic menace that could dismantle his life without ever raising its voice. Simultaneously, Dr. Thorne began to encounter her own set of obstacles. The Nevada Highway Patrol report on the incident, which she had initially obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, was suddenly reclassified. The new version she received was heavily redacted, with entire sections blacked out. The names of the responding officers were gone. The detailed description of the road markings was gone. The report was now a useless, empty shell. Then, her lab was broken into. Nothing was stolen, not her computers, not her expensive equipment. The only things missing were the physical samples from the Route 395 site, the asphalt scrapings, and the microscopic metallic flakes. The local police investigated, but found no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no leads. It was a professional job, clean and silent. A clear message had been sent. Thorne reached out to a trusted contact, a retired Air Force colonel who had become a quiet whistleblower in the UFO community. Speaking on deep background, the colonel confirmed her suspicions. The event on Route 395 had triggered a major response from a highly classified rapid response unit, a group tasked with investigating and retrieving materials from crash sites of unknown origin. The official story about flares was a standard protocol, a Level 1 public denial. The visit to Frank Coleman was witness mitigation. The seizure of her evidence was material recovery. The colonel explained that the entity Frank encountered was not part of any known U.S. military inventory. It was something else, something they designated as a non-cooperative target of interest. The military's primary objective was not to inform the public, but to control the narrative, suppress the evidence, and acquire the technology for themselves at any cost. This was the great unspoken truth of the UFO phenomenon. It was not just a scientific mystery, it was a national security issue of the highest order. The conflict was not merely between belief and skepticism, but between the public's right to know and the government's perceived need to maintain a monopoly on the most profound secret in human history. The authority was not just a faceless bureaucracy. It was a well-oiled machine of suppression honed by decades of practice. And now, both Frank Coleman and Eris Thorne were caught in its gears, two individuals who had stumbled upon a truth so immense that the powers that be would do anything to keep it buried in the desert darkness. Dr. Thorne, undeterred by the theft of her primary evidence, knew that the truth could not be so easily erased. The phenomenon, whatever its source, was not a singular event. It was a pattern, and patterns leave echoes. She turned her investigation away from the now sanitized site on Route 395 and began to cast a wider net, digging into archives, cross-referencing databases, and reaching out to her network of civilian spotters and researchers. She was looking for corroborating witnesses, for other data points from that same night, along that same lonely corridor of high strangeness. Her persistence paid off. She uncovered a report from a commercial airline pilot who had been flying a red-eye route from Seattle to Las Vegas. His flight path had taken him over central Nevada at approximately 3:00 a.m. His official flight log noted a period of severe radio interference and unexplained navigational equipment malfunction. In a confidential report filed later with a civilian aviation safety network, he described what he believed was the cause: a large, dark, unlit object that paced his aircraft for several minutes before accelerating away at a speed he calculated to be in excess of Mach 5 without producing a sonic boom. The object had been visible on his weather radar as a massive, dense return, but it was not broadcasting any transponder signal. He had not reported it to air traffic control for fear of ridicule and the potential loss of his career. The time and location corresponded perfectly with Frank's encounter. Next, Thorne found a post on an obscure online forum for amateur astronomers. A hobbyist stargazer, set up with his telescope in the foothills of the White Mountains, which overlooked that stretch of Route 395, had also seen something. He described a silent, luminous disk that descended into the valley and then vanished in a brilliant flash. He had even managed to capture a series of digital photographs. The images were blurry, compromised by distance and atmospheric distortion, but they clearly showed a structured, self-luminous object that was not a star, not a planet, and not a conventional aircraft. It was another piece of the puzzle. The most compelling corroboration came from a geologist who had been checking a series of remote seismic sensors in the area. Her equipment, designed to detect minute earth tremors, had gone haywire at exactly 3:13 a.m. She had recorded a powerful burst of infrasound, a low-frequency sound below the range of human hearing, and a localized magnetic pulse that had temporarily wiped the memory of one of her sensors. She had logged it as an equipment malfunction caused by a possible meteor airburst, but when Thorne showed her the pilot's report and the astronomer's photos, she conceded that the data was more consistent with the presence of a powerful artificial energy source operating at low altitude. A pattern was emerging, a clear triangulation of evidence from the air, from a distant vantage point, and from the ground. Frank Coleman was not alone in his experience that night. He was simply the one who had been closest. Thorne began to weave these threads together, connecting them to the broader history of the region. She mapped out decades of sightings, of cattle mutilations, of abduction claims, and of unexplained military activity. The map she created was startling. The incidents were not random. They were clustered along specific geological fault lines and areas with high concentrations of quartz and other piezoelectric minerals. Her theory grew bolder. What if the phenomena were drawn to these locations? What if the Earth's own geomagnetic field, concentrated and focused by the unique geology of the region, created a kind of natural beacon or perhaps a power source that these craft could interact with? This would explain the ancient myths of the Paiute and Shoshone, who would have had an intimate multi-generational knowledge of where the sky gods were most likely to appear. It would also explain the intense military interest in the area. Perhaps the secret bases like Area 51 were not just for testing new aircraft, but were strategically placed to study and potentially intercept these visitors who were drawn to the region's unique properties. The corridor was not just a flight path, it was a destination. The encounter on Route 395 was not a random stop. It was a planned interaction, a moment where a vast ancient intelligence briefly and deliberately intersected with a single representative human. The message Frank had received, the cascade of images showing the Earth as a living, energetic system, suddenly took on a new, more profound meaning. It wasn't just a random data dump, it was an explanation. It was a map. They were showing him how they saw the world and why they were here. Frank Coleman's lonely road was, it turned out, a major intersection on an interstellar highway, and he had been witness to a traveler pulling over to read the signs. What, then, are we to make of the story of Frank Coleman? What truly happened on that desolate stretch of Nevada highway in the lonely hours before dawn? We are left with a fractured narrative, a collision of irreconcilable truths. On one side, we have the official explanation, a comforting and dismissive tale of military flares and mechanical failure. It is a story designed to close the book, to tuck the anomaly away into a neat file labeled Explained, and to allow the world to continue spinning on its familiar axis. It is an explanation that requires us to believe in a series of improbable coincidences and to ignore the testimony of a credible man. It asks us to trust the authority, even when that authority confiscates evidence, redacts reports, and intimidates witnesses into silence. On the other side, we have a far more complex and unsettling account. We have the testimony of a man with nothing to gain and everything to lose, a man whose life was irrevocably altered by 6 minutes of impossible reality. We have the forensic analysis of a dedicated researcher, pointing towards physical evidence of a technology that defies our current understanding of physics and material science. We have corroborating accounts from independent, credible sources, a pilot, an astronomer, a geologist, all of whom witnessed a piece of the same profound anomaly. This account does not offer easy answers. It opens a Pandora's box of questions that strike at the very heart of our understanding of the universe and our place within it. Who are these visitors? Where do they come from? What is the purpose of their silent, ceaseless reconnaissance of our world? The long-term effects on Frank Coleman are perhaps the most telling piece of evidence. He never drove long haul again. The open road, once his sanctuary, had become a source of profound anxiety. He sold his rig, the Vagrant, and took a local dispatch job, needing to be home every night, surrounded by the familiar and the mundane. He suffered from insomnia and recurring nightmares filled with the alien images that had been forced into his mind. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, a diagnosis that seemed woefully inadequate to describe the psychic wound he had sustained. He had looked behind the curtain, had been shown a reality too vast for the human mind to comfortably contain, and he could never go back. He had been given a glimpse of the scale of the cosmos, and in return had lost his own sense of place. Dr. Eris Thorne continued her work, publishing a heavily censored version of her findings that omitted any mention of the physical evidence she had briefly possessed. She focused instead on the patterns, the witness testimony, the historical context. Her paper was met with ridicule from the mainstream scientific community, but became a foundational text for the next generation of UFO researchers. She argued that the phenomenon was not just about nuts and bolts, craft from other planets. It was something more complex, perhaps. Interdimensional, a phenomenon that interacted with and was mediated by human consciousness itself. The craft Frank saw might not have been a physical object in the way we understand it, but a projection, an interface between our reality and another, a place where physics and consciousness blur. The ultimate mystery remains. Was the message Frank received a warning, a greeting, or simply the byproduct of a biological mind coming into contact with a post-biological intelligence, like the static generated when two incompatible operating systems try to connect? The images of the Earth as a living, energetic entity suggest a perspective that is holistic, ancient, and utterly alien. Perhaps they see our planet not as a collection of nations and individuals, but as a single complex organism, and humanity as a volatile and perhaps endangered part of its ecosystem. The encounter on Route 395 was not an invasion. It was not an attack. It was an act of profound and perhaps terrifying intimacy, a brief direct contact that shattered one man's world in order to show him a glimpse of 1,000 others. We are left in the same position as Frank Coleman, standing on the edge of a dark, empty road, staring into a sky that we thought we knew. The silence of the desert holds its secrets close. The stars continue their silent wheeling dance, and we are left to wonder what other appointments are being kept in the lonely places of the world, and what other truths are waiting for us just around the next bend. The only certainty is that the universe is far stranger and far more crowded than we have ever dared to imagine.